Somewhere over the Iranian desert in 1982, a Soviet-built MiG-23 broke apart at 14,000 feet. The pilot never saw the aircraft that killed him. He never saw the missile either. An AIM-54 Phoenix, launched from an Iranian F-14 Tomcat roughly 60 miles away, had crossed that distance in under a minute. The MiG's radar warning receiver lit up too late to matter. By the time the tone screamed in his headset, the missile had already gone active on its own seeker. The engagement lasted seconds. The debris field stretched a quarter mile. That kill, and a handful like it during the Iran-Iraq War, sent shockwaves through Soviet tactical aviation that no amount of official denial could suppress. The Phoenix destroyed more than aircraft. It wrecked the entire framework Soviet planners had built their fighter doctrine around. Soviet fighter doctrine through the 1970s rested on a simple premise: close the distance, exploit numbers, force a turning fight where skill and aggressiveness could neutralize American technology. The AIM-54 made that premise suicidal. A weapon with a published range of over 100 miles meant the F-14 could engage Soviet formations before they even knew a fight had started. If you're getting something out of this kind of breakdown, the stuff that doesn't make it into the highlight reels, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. A like pushes this to more people who care about the real history. And drop a comment if there's a Cold War topic you want torn apart next. The Soviets understood the math. Their own long-range missile programs lagged behind, and they knew it. The R-33, carried by the MiG-31, represented Moscow's answer to the Phoenix, but it entered service years later and equipped an interceptor designed for a different mission entirely. The gap between American and Soviet beyond visual range capability in the mid-70s wasn't marginal. It ran deep enough to force a doctrinal rethinking at the highest levels of Soviet air defense. The Phoenix's combat record remains murky. Iran claims dozens of kills during the war with Iraq. American analysts dispute some of those numbers, and the classified Iranian maintenance records that might settle the question stay locked away in Tehran. Sources conflict on nearly every specific engagement, but the kill count almost doesn't matter. What mattered, what kept Soviet military planners awake, wasn't how many times the Phoenix had worked. It was what happened to your entire tactical approach when your opponent could reach out and touch you at 60 nautical miles. That single capability forced the Soviet Air Force to rewrite how its pilots trained, how its formations flew, what its engineers built next, and how its electronic warfare units prioritized their development. Mike Pelehach slammed his fist on a conference table at Grumman's Bethpage facility in 1968 and told the Navy's evaluation team that his company's design could track 24 targets simultaneously. The room went quiet. Every other proposal on the table could manage maybe 8. Pelehach, Grumman's chief project engineer, had spent 2 years refining what would become the AWG-9 weapons system, the radar and fire control backbone that made the F-14 more than just another fighter. He understood something the competition apparently didn't. The Navy's real problem had nothing to do with dogfighting. It arrived at Mach 2, 50 feet above the water, in waves of 12 or more. The Tu-22M backfire bomber represented the Soviet Union's most credible threat to American carrier battle groups through the 1970s and 80s. Each backfire carried up to 3 Kh-22 kitchen anti-ship missiles, massive weapons, 37 feet long, capable of reaching Mach 4 in their terminal dive. A single kitchen could cripple a carrier. A regiment of backfires launching 36 kitchens simultaneously could overwhelm every air defense system the Navy possessed in 1967. The admirals in charge of fleet defense ran the scenarios over and over. The math kept coming back ugly. Standard fighters of that era, the F-4 Phantom, capable as it remained in many roles, simply couldn't engage enough inbound targets fast enough. An F-4 crew could track one target, fire on one target, then reacquire. Against a massed raid, that arithmetic meant kitchens getting through and hitting flight decks. It meant carriers burning. So, Grumman built an aircraft around a weapons system instead of the other way around. The AWG-9 radar could detect a bomber-sized target at 195 nautical miles. It could track 24 contacts and guide 6 Phoenix missiles to 6 separate targets at the same time. No other fighter on Earth could do that in 1970 or 1980, and arguably not until decades later. The F-14's entire airframe existed to carry that radar, those missiles, and enough fuel to loiter on combat air patrol stations for hours while waiting for the raid that might never come. The variable sweep wing, the signature visual feature of the Tomcat, served this mission profile directly. Wings swept forward at 20 degrees for slow-speed loiter and carrier approaches. Wings swept back to 68 degrees for high-speed intercepts. The geometry let one aircraft do 2 completely different jobs without compromise in either. Captain William Bear Lassiter, who flew early fleet evaluation trials aboard the USS Enterprise, put it bluntly to his squadron: "We finally have a fighter that fights the war the Soviets actually planned to give us." The timeline pressures on this program bordered on reckless. The Navy had already burned through the disastrous F-111B program, a joint Air Force-Navy fighter that gained weight like a retirement project and handled like one too. Congress killed the F-111B in 1968. Grumman received the F-14 contract in January of 1969. The first prototype flew in December of 1970. That's 22 months from contract to first flight for a twin-engine, variable geometry, fleet defense interceptor carrying the most sophisticated radar ever installed in a fighter. Grumman pulled it off by cannibalizing lessons from the F-111B's failures: the wing pivot design, the engine spacing, the weight discipline that General Dynamics had abandoned. The second prototype crashed on its second flight due to hydraulic failure. Both crew members ejected safely. The program kept moving. Nobody at Grumman or in the Navy had time to slow down because every intelligence estimate showed backfire production accelerating. By 1973, Soviet naval aviation operated enough backfires to mount simultaneous raids against carrier groups in both the Atlantic and Pacific. The F-14 reached initial operational capability in September of 1974 aboard the Enterprise. 12 aircraft, 2 squadrons. Standing between the Soviet bomber fleet and $7 billion of American naval power. Each Phoenix missile weighed just under 1,000 pounds, 985 to be exact. Nearly half that weight sat in the rocket motor. The rest split between a 135-pound continuous rod warhead and the most advanced guidance package ever crammed into an air-to-air weapon. Hughes Aircraft built the seeker head around a combination that nobody else attempted: semi-active radar homing for the cruise phase, then a switch to fully active terminal guidance in the final seconds. That dual-mode approach meant the launching F-14 only needed to illuminate the target during mid-course updates. The missile finished the job alone. Why does that matter? Because it freed the Tomcat crew to do something unprecedented. Fire, update briefly, then turn the radar to the next target. 6 missiles tracking 6 separate contacts across a 100-mile swath of sky, each one making its own terminal intercept decisions without further input from the aircraft. No Soviet system could replicate that independence. The R-33 required continuous guidance from the MiG-31's Zaslon radar. 1 missile, 1 target, full attention until impact. The Americans had built a fire-and-forget weapon at intercontinental fighter ranges. The Soviets had built a very fast telephone that needed someone holding the line. The speed figures still stagger. The AIM-54 accelerated to Mach 4.3 in its initial motor burn, then climbed to a high-altitude cruise trajectory where reduced drag let it sustain above Mach 5. At maximum range shots, 126 nautical miles in the famous 1973 test against a BQM-34 target drone, the missile flew for nearly 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes of flight time covering a distance most pilots couldn't even see across on a clear day. The drone never maneuvered. Real targets would. But the geometry still favored the shooter, because at those closing speeds, even aggressive, evasive turns bought a target maybe 3 additional seconds of life. The simultaneous engagement test happened on November 21, 1973, over the Pacific Missile Range at Point Mugu. A single F-14 launched 6 Phoenix missiles in under a minute against 6 drone targets flying at different altitudes and headings. 4 hits, 1 miss, 1 missile suffered a motor failure and fell into the ocean. 4 out of 6 against independent targets spread across the sky. The Navy called that result operationally decisive, and they weren't exaggerating. No other weapon system in any country's inventory could produce anything close to that performance for another 20 years. The British had tried something similar with the Skyflash program in the early 80s, pushing for multi-target capability on the Tornado ADV and settled for tracking multiple contacts but engaging them one at a time. Back to the Phoenix, that Point Mugu test created a problem the Soviets simply couldn't solve with existing technology. An irrelevant detail buried in the test documentation. One of the target drones carried an experimental paint scheme meant to test infrared signature reduction. The paint performed terribly. It has nothing to do with the Phoenix story, but someone spent 6 months developing it. The real engineering triumph wasn't any single specification. Speed, range, guidance, autonomous terminal homing, each one impressive individually. Together, they produced a weapon that invalidated Soviet attack doctrine at the mathematical level. You cannot plan a massed bomber raid when the defender kills 6 of your aircraft before your formation crosses the radar horizon. The raid never reaches launch range, the kitchens stay on their pylons, and the carrier group sails on untouched. Soviet naval aviation pilots knew they were flying into a kill zone. That statement isn't dramatic license. It comes directly from translated briefing materials captured after the Cold War ended, documents that circulated through frontal aviation and Soviet naval aviation training units from the mid-70s onward. The language in those briefings carried none of the propaganda gloss that characterized public Soviet military communications. These documents addressed professionals who needed accurate threat assessments to survive. The tone ran clinical, almost fatalistic. The briefings broke the F-14 threat into phases, and every phase favored the American crew. Phase 1. Detection. Soviet intelligence had mapped the AWG-9's capabilities with uncomfortable precision. Briefing documents noted that the Tomcat's radar could acquire a formation of bombers at ranges exceeding 170 nautical miles, further than any Soviet airborne radar could see in return. The MiG-23's Sapphire-23 radar detected fighter-sized targets at roughly 35 nautical miles. A backfire crew scanning for threats might pick up the F-14 at 50. By that point, the Phoenix had already covered half the distance to intercept. Soviet pilots received this information in stark numerical comparisons, side by side on chalkboards in briefing rooms from Severomorsk to Vladivostok. One instructor at the Saki Naval Aviation School reportedly summarized the detection gap with 5 words. They see you seeing nothing. Phase 2. Engagement. The briefings emphasized that standard Soviet electronic countermeasures, the SPS-141 and SPS-143 jamming pods carried by backfire crews, showed limited effectiveness against the AWG-9's pulse Doppler modes. Soviet ECM development had optimized against older American radars, particularly the F-4's AN/APG-59. The AWG-9 operated on different frequencies with different waveforms. Updating Soviet jammers to counter it required hardware changes that moved through the Soviet defense bureaucracy at geological speed. Crews flew, knowing their primary electronic shield had holes in it. Phase 3, and this is where the briefing materials turned grim, concerned the missile itself. Soviet analysts had reconstructed the Phoenix's flight profile from radar tracking data gathered during American test shots over the Pacific. The high-altitude cruise trajectory, the terminal active seeker, the closure rate in a head-on engagement exceeding Mach 6 when you combined the missile's speed with the target's own velocity. All of it had been cataloged. At that closure rate, a backfire pilot had approximately 4 seconds between his radar warning receiver detecting the Phoenix's active seeker and the moment of impact. 4 seconds. A human blink takes a third of a second. Soviet briefing materials allocated 12 of those 4 seconds to... That math doesn't work, and the briefers knew it didn't work. The documents state that evasive maneuvering against a terminal phase Phoenix offered, in their phrasing, negligible survival probability. Their words. So, what did they tell pilots to do? The answer reveals how seriously Moscow took the threat. Soviet naval aviation rewrote its entire approach to carrier battle group attack profiles between 1976 and 1980. The new doctrine pushed backfire formations down to ultra-low altitude, below 50 meters over open ocean, to exploit the AWG-9's reduced look-down capability in heavy sea clutter. Formations spread laterally to force the F-14 to divide its radar attention. Timing compressed so that all aircraft in a regiment reached missile launch range within a 30-second window, saturating the Tomcat's ability to engage sequentially. Every tactical adjustment started from the same assumption. You cannot defeat the Phoenix in flight, so you must avoid being targeted in the first place. The human cost of this doctrine shift landed squarely on Soviet aircrews. Flying a 60-ton bomber at Mach 1.5 below 50 meters over the North Atlantic in winter, at night, in radio silence, maintaining formation spacing through turbulence that could slam an aircraft into the waves, demanded a kind of flying that killed people in training. Soviet naval aviation accident rates for backfire units climbed sharply after 1978. The records from that period remain partially classified on the Russian side. But Western intelligence estimates suggest the Tu-22M fleet lost between 8 and 12 aircraft to training accidents in the 5 years following the doctrine change. Crews died practicing how to avoid a missile that might never actually launch at them. Lieutenant Commander Jack Fencer Enright, who flew F-14s with VF-32 out of NAS Oceana during that period, recalled watching Soviet reconnaissance aircraft photograph his Tomcat on the flight deck. They'd fly right over us, cameras clicking like they couldn't get enough pictures. He figured they needed something concrete to show their pilots back home, to make the threat briefings real. Major Jalil Zandi turned to his radar intercept officer in the back seat of their F-14 and said 2 words, Fox 3. The date, September 22, 1980. The first day of the Iran-Iraq War. Within hours, Iranian Tomcats scored kills that validated everything the Soviets had feared for 6 years. Iran received 79 F-14s and approximately 284 Phoenix missiles before the 1979 revolution severed the relationship with Washington. The Shah's pilots trained at NAS Miramar alongside American crews. They learned the same tactics, flew the same intercept profiles, absorbed the same doctrine about fleet defense and long-range engagement. When Saddam Hussein's Air Force crossed the border, those Iranian crews possessed the only combat-proven opportunity to fire the AIM-54 in anger. The results confirmed what Point Mugu had demonstrated on paper. The Iraqi Air Force flew Soviet equipment, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25 Foxbats, and a small fleet of Tu-22 blinder bombers tasked with striking Iranian oil infrastructure. The blinders represented almost exactly the threat profile the F-14 had been designed to kill. Fast, high altitude, carrying standoff weapons, relying on speed and altitude to survive. Iraqi blinder crews flying toward Karg Island oil terminals in the fall of 1980 encountered something their Soviet training had warned them about, but never prepared them to defeat. Iranian F-14s picked them up at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles, launched Phoenix missiles, and turned away before the blinders ever knew they faced an intercept. Sources conflict on the exact number of blinder kills attributed to Phoenix shots in those first weeks. Iranian records claim between 3 and 5, while Western intelligence confirmed at least 2 through signals intercepts. The Iraqi Tu-22 force effectively stopped flying deep penetration missions against Iranian targets by November of 1980. 2 months into the war, a bomber fleet grounded not by attrition, but by terror. The MiG-25 engagements tell an even more striking story. Iraqi Foxbats conducted high-altitude reconnaissance runs over Iranian territory at speeds above Mach 2.5, fast enough to outrun every fighter and missile system in the Middle East except one. An Iranian F-14 crew, the pilot's name remains disputed between 2 different squadron histories, engaged an Iraqi MiG-23 at a range later estimated between 60 and 80 nautical miles. The Foxbat flew at approximately 70,000 feet. The Phoenix climbed to meet it, transitioned to active guidance, and detonated close enough to shred the MiG's left engine and horizontal stabilizer. The Iraqi pilot ejected over Iranian territory. He'd been flying at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, above the operational ceiling of every surface-to-air missile Iraq's enemies possessed, and a weapon fired from a fighter he never detected killed his aircraft. From a distance, he probably couldn't have seen across, even if he'd known where to look. The engagement echoed through every air force flying Soviet equipment. Baghdad sent urgent requests to Moscow for updated threat assessments on the Phoenix. Moscow's response, partially reconstructed from Iraqi archives captured in 2003, essentially repeated what Soviet briefing rooms had already concluded. Do not fly within 150 kilometers of a confirmed F-14 combat air patrol. Avoid, evade, abort. Do not attempt to outrun the missile. The Iraqis learned in blood what Soviet naval aviation had learned in chalkboard equations. The Phoenix killed at ranges that made conventional air combat irrelevant. Neither speed nor altitude offered sanctuary. Zandi himself went on to score 11 confirmed aerial victories during the Iran-Iraq War, the highest-scoring F-14 pilot in history, American or otherwise. 8 of those kills came with the Tomcat's shorter-range Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles in visual or medium-range engagements. But his Phoenix shots, fired into empty sky at targets his own eyes couldn't find, those defined what the aircraft meant. Lieutenant Commander Dave Bio Baranek pressed his face into the rubber hood of the tactical information display and watched 6 green symbols crawl across the scope. The AWG-9 painted everything within 150 miles. Cargo ships, weather returns, and, somewhere northeast, a pair of contacts moving at 460 knots on a closing vector. His pilot, up front, couldn't see any of this. The RIO owned the kill chain. Bio's right thumb hovered over the weapons select switch. The contacts crossed the 100-mile mark. He squeezed. What happened next took 140 seconds. From the Tomcat's belly, a 1,000-pound cylinder dropped free, its motor igniting half a second later with a white-orange plume that stretched 20 feet behind the weapon. The Phoenix climbed, not toward the target, but upward, seeking thin air, trading fuel for altitude, where drag fell to almost nothing. Inside the cockpit, the only evidence of launch: a mild shudder, a tone shift in the headset, 1 fewer symbol on the weapon status panel, and a slight change in the jet's trim. Bio updated the missile twice through the data link, each correction lasting less than a second. Then, he turned the radar to the second contact. The first Phoenix flew alone now, its own seeker head warming, waiting for the programmed moment to go active. From the other end, from the cockpit of whatever aircraft occupied that green symbol, the experience compressed into something barely survivable. Silence first. Complete electromagnetic silence. The radar warning receiver stayed dark. No tone, no threat indicator, nothing on any instrument suggesting that death had already launched and climbed and begun its descent. The Phoenix's seeker stayed passive during cruise, receiving but not transmitting. For nearly 2 minutes, the target flew in perfect ignorance. Then the seeker went active. A shriek in the headset. The radar warning receiver lit with a signal unlike anything in the threat library. High PRF, X-band, closing at a combined velocity that made the Doppler shift almost unreadable. The pilot had time to look at the warning light and move his hand toward the stick. He did not have time to complete the thought that connected those 2 actions. At Mach 6 closure, the distance between active seeker detection and warhead detonation covered itself in under 4 seconds. The continuous rod warhead expanded in a ring of metal fragments moving at 6,000 feet per second. An expanding hoop of tungsten alloy cutting through aluminum skin, hydraulic lines, fuel cells, control surfaces, and human tissue with absolute indifference to what it found. The Tomcat crew felt nothing, saw nothing. Bio watched a green symbol disappear from his scope and said 2 words into the intercom. Splash 1. At the Vimpel Design Bureau in Tushino, northwest Moscow, engineers received their directive in 1972. Build a missile that does what the Phoenix does. They spent 11 years trying. The R-33, NATO reporting name Amos, entered service in 1981 aboard the MiG-31 Foxhound. 11 years from directive to operational capability. The Phoenix went from contract to fleet deployment in 7. Why did the Soviets need 4 extra years? The answer lives in component technology. The Phoenix's DSQ-26 seeker used a continuous wave semi-active mode during mid-course and switched to active radar terminal guidance. A trick that required miniaturized, solid-state electronics the Soviet Union simply could not manufacture at scale in the early 70s. Soviet engineers built the R-33's seeker around vacuum tube technology. Heavier, less reliable, more power-hungry. They compensated with a larger airframe. The R-33 weighed over 1,000 pounds, slightly heavier than the Phoenix, yet carried a smaller warhead. More weight devoted to the electronics that American engineers had already shrunk to half the volume. The MiG-31 itself told the same story of reactive engineering. Its Zaslon radar, the first electronically scanned phased array fitted to a fighter anywhere in the world, tracked 10 targets and engaged 4 simultaneously. Impressive numbers. But the Tomcat's AWG-9 had tracked 24 and engaged 6 since 1974. The Soviets achieved in 1981 what Grumman delivered 7 years prior, and achieved less of it. What irritates me about this comparison is how it usually gets framed. People call the MiG-31 a peer to the F-14. It carried long-range missiles, it had a powerful radar, it flew fast at Mach 2.83, and it looked like a counterpart on paper. But equivalence on paper ignored the operational reality that the MiG-31 existed because the F-14 existed. Every design choice Mikoyan made responded to a problem Grumman had created. The Foxhound's blistering straight-line speed compensated for the fact that Soviet ground control intercept stations needed to vector it into position. It lacked the autonomous search and engage capability that let a Tomcat crew hunt independently across 200 miles of ocean. Speed replaced flexibility because brute force was all the doctrine allowed. The R-33's maximum range sat around 75 nautical miles under ideal conditions. The Phoenix reached over 100. That 25-mile gap meant everything in a head-on engagement between the two platforms. The F-14 crew launches first. Period. The MiG-31 pilot closes that distance knowing a Phoenix is already in the air, already climbing toward him, locked and seeking. He must survive the inbound missile, maintain his own radar lock, and reach his own launch parameters, all while his opponent turns cold and accelerates away. Colonel Anatoly Kovalchuk, one of the Soviet Union's premier test pilots, flew early MiG-31 prototypes at Zhukovsky Airfield. He described the aircraft as a response to a situation we hoped would never actually happen. That sentence contains the entire Cold War air-to-air story. America built the crisis. The Soviet Union built the response. The response arrived late and heavy, hoping it would never face the thing it was designed to fight. November 19, 1987, a Monday morning at the Naval Weapons Center, Point Mugu. A supply officer named Lieutenant Karen Weiss, an incidental detail, her name appears on the cover sheet but nowhere else in the document, signed a logistics summary that put the unit cost of a single AIM-54C Phoenix missile at $946,000. Adjusted for inflation, that crossed the $1 million mark before the ink dried on the next fiscal year's budget, $1 million per shot. The Navy carried roughly 2,600 Phoenix missiles in its total inventory across the fleet. Each F-14 carried 6. A full combat loadout for a single aircraft cost more than most houses in the cities where the pilots grew up. And the airframe that carried them devoured 37 maintenance hours for every flight hour. A ratio so punishing that squadron readiness rates hovered around 55% on a good deployment. The Tomcat ate money in a way that made Pentagon accountants physically uncomfortable. So, why does this matter beyond sticker shock? Because the Phoenix killed the Phoenix. The missile performed exactly as designed. It terrorized Soviet planners, grounded Iraqi bombers, forced an entire superpower to redesign its naval aviation doctrine around avoidance. And then the Navy looked at the bill and flinched. The AIM-120 AMRAAM entered development in 1979 with a specific mandate: give every fighter in the inventory an active radar missile at a fraction of the Phoenix's cost. The AMRAAM weighed 335 pounds. It cost roughly $380,000 per round in early production. It couldn't reach 60 miles or climb to 70,000 feet, couldn't autonomously hunt a bomber formation at the edge of radar coverage. But you could buy 3 of them for the price of one Phoenix, hang them on an F-15 or F-16 or F-18, and those airframes cost half what the Tomcat cost to maintain. The British learned something similar with the Bloodhound surface-to-air missile system in the late 50s, a weapon so capable and so expensive that the RAF kept reducing its deployments until the coverage gaps made the whole network pointless. A weapon no one can afford to field ends up in a museum. Back to Point Mugu. By 1992, the writing covered every wall. The last Phoenix production run delivered its final missiles to the fleet that year. No more orders followed. The Navy had already committed to the F-18 Super Hornet as the Tomcat's replacement. A jet that couldn't carry the Phoenix, couldn't match the AWG-9's range, and lacked the ability to engage 6 targets simultaneously at 100 miles. It could fly 260 sorties per aircraft per year instead of the Tomcat's 140. Bureaucracy won. The spreadsheet beat the kill chain. Captain Dale Snodgrass, widely considered the finest F-14 demonstration pilot who ever lived, flew his last Tomcat airshow routine in 2003. He pulled the jet into a slow-speed pass at full wing sweep. 54,000 pounds of American engineering hanging on nothing but thrust and angle of attack. The twin TF-30 engines howling so loud that car alarms triggered in the parking lot a mile from the runway. The crowd saw grace. Snodgrass felt the shudder through his flight gloves. That particular vibration the Tomcat made at high alpha, the airframe talking to the pilot, telling him exactly how close to the edge he stood. The last operational Phoenix firing occurred on September 22, 2004. The target drone survived. The missile's motor fired, the seeker acquired, and the weapon flew its profile flawlessly for 110 seconds before a guidance component, age-degraded, its manufacturer out of business since 1995, sent it 4 degrees off axis, close enough to trigger the proximity fuse, not close enough to kill. The drone flew home. So did the Tomcat. Neither had much time left. The Phoenix changed how every Air Force on Earth thinks about range, even the ones that never faced it. That claim sounds broad. It isn't. Before 1974, air combat doctrine across NATO and the Warsaw Pact assumed that engagements began somewhere between 5 and 20 miles. Fighters closed to visual range more often than not. The kill required proximity. The Phoenix obliterated that assumption so completely that no serious military planner has returned to it since. Every long-range air-to-air missile developed after 1980 carries the Phoenix's DNA. The AMRAAM compressed the concept into a smaller, cheaper package: active radar terminal guidance, fire and forget, launch and leave. The Russian R-77 Adder followed the same architecture, the Chinese PL-12, the European Meteor. All of them solved the same problem the Phoenix solved first: kill a target that your pilot cannot see with his eyes. The specific solutions differ: ramjet sustainers, dual-pulse motors, inertial mid-course with GPS updates. But the operational concept remains what Hughes aircraft demonstrated over the Pacific Missile Range in 1973. Detect at maximum range, launch at maximum range, and turn away before the enemy knows you exist. The Phoenix proved that doctrine worked. Everyone else spent 30 years making it affordable. The psychological dimension persisted long after the missile left inventory. During Operation Southern Watch in the late 90s, Iraqi MiG-23 pilots routinely turned away from carrier group combat air patrols at distances exceeding 80 miles. The F-14s carried AMRAAM by then. The Phoenix had already been restricted to emergency loadouts only. its aging components too unreliable for routine sorties. But Iraqi radar warning receivers couldn't distinguish between an AWG-9 in search mode and an AWG-9 preparing a Phoenix launch. The reputation did the work. Intelligence summaries from that period, partially declassified in 2011, describe Iraqi pilot behavior using the phrase avoidance patterning, meaning they had internalized a boundary they would not cross, 70 to 80 miles from the nearest Tomcat. That boundary matched Phoenix engagement range almost exactly. The missile sat in storage. Its ghost flew combat air patrol. The retirement narrative bothers me. The Navy tells a clean story. The Tomcat got old, the Super Hornet arrived, capabilities transferred. But capabilities didn't transfer. They shrank. The F-18E carries 6 AMRAAMs with a maximum effective range of roughly 40 nautical miles against a maneuvering target. The F-14 carried 6 Phoenix missiles effective to 100 miles against a non-maneuvering target and 60-plus against one that was. The fleet traded reach for sortie rate. More jets in the air, each one blind past 40 miles. Whether that trade made operational sense depends on which threat you believe matters. A massed Soviet bomber regiment that no longer exists, or a dispersed insurgency that doesn't require beyond visual range engagement at all. The calculus made sense in 2006. Sources conflict on whether it still does. The AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile, the Phoenix's true spiritual successor, entered development sometime around 2015. Exact specifications stay classified. What leaked suggests a range exceeding 100 nautical miles, active and passive seeker modes, and compatibility with the F-22 and F-35. 50 years after Hughes engineers first solved the problem of autonomous long-range air-to-air engagement, Lockheed Martin engineers solved it again, with better electronics and smaller packaging, plus a classified price tag that reportedly made the Phoenix look like a bargain. Someone at Naval Air Systems Command apparently used that exact phrase in a budget meeting. Made the Phoenix look like a bargain. The file doesn't attribute it further. On the 22nd of September 2006, exactly 2 years after the last Phoenix firing, VF-213 and VF-31 flew their final Tomcat sorties over Iraq, dropped laser-guided bombs on ground targets, and recovered aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The jets trapped, taxied forward, and shut down for the last time as operational combat aircraft. The maintenance chiefs pulled the intake covers on. The plane captains laid their hands flat on the fuselage, a gesture no regulation requires, and then walked to the ready room to begin paperwork, transferring them to Super Hornet squadrons. Lieutenant Chad Scorch Hennings, one of the last RIOs to fly a combat sortie in the F-14, opened his nav bag in the ready room and started filling out his post-flight report. Line 1, mission type. Line 2, ordnance expended. Line 3, aircraft status. He wrote the word down.